Reverend William Augustus Muhlenberg was an Episcopal priest at the Church of the Holy Communion in Manhattan. And he had very progressive ideas. He wanted to help the needy, the orphan, the crippled, and wanted to get needy kids out of the city slums. And that's how it got started.
Early community was really named St. John.
A rural farming community. We had a couple of houses, number of farms, and a lot of woods separating them. There was nothing going on here. It was something you went through. It's not something you stayed at. There was basically one road running through town, and that was what we know today as St. John Road, and that connected Smithtown to Huntington. In fact, on many of the old maps, it listed as the road to Huntington one way and the road to Smithtown in another direction. It doesn't have the name at all on it.
And it's always a great discussion as to where the name Kings Park came from. The name really came from a little park in Jamaica called King Park. And it was actually the railroad people who named the station Kings Park.
Kings Park has 20,000 residents today. The railroad made the world of difference, and ever since that came to town, Kings Park has been growing by leaps and bounds. What we know as Kings Park today brought up many of the goods and services from Connecticut, because we're right across the water, and the Nessaquag River, before the railroad station came out here, was a main way, main traffic for getting the goods into Smithtown. At the turn of the century, the conditions in New York City were very tough. They were overcrowded, there was rampant disease, it was lawless, and the city had grown. And so many of these organizations which were originally set up in New York City couldn't function there anymore. They wanted to get out of the city, and Kings Park was that place, especially after the Reverend set up St. John Lynn Home for Children.
Dr. Muhlenberg's dream was that to set up a community where particularly inner city people could receive training in a farm community setting, and then they could take those skills back to the city. As far away as Switzerland, they were watching some of the things that Muhlenberg was doing at St. John.
It was set up basically as a training school, what they call a stereotype foundry, printing press, making umbrellas, making hats, and a little bit of farming. And for the girls, it was more of a domestic thing, sewing, knitting, cooking, that kind of thing.
The early concept of the kinds of help that poor inner city people needed.
Well, his dream was a utopian community, paradise, Shangri-La, oasis. And that's what St. John was back in the 40s when I first arrived there, 10 years old. We were kind of poor, because, when I was there, there were no full-fledged orphans. They were generally half orphans. My father had died. So we really had no money. We had one big playground, 400 acres of woods and farm and beach. What I especially loved about being at St. John, and I still think of it to this day, is the communal effect. In other words, at one big house, they had anywhere from 24 to 30 boys and two big dorms upstairs. So there was never a sad moment.
Everyone according to their needs. It was very important to the Reverend to be able to take care of the children who were most in need. Back then, they didn't have the same social services provided by the government, and so the religious institutions and motivated individuals would provide those services, and the Reverend was one of those.
It was in 1885 is when Kings County established what they call a lunatic asylum. And again, it was an interesting experiment because they were using some of the elements of the Muhlenberg experiment. The early hospital was set up in a farm setting, and they had, as we would call them sometimes, patients or clients lived in little cottages, and then they helped to maintain that community.
The psychiatric center, when it was opened up, there was nothing out here. There was no electricity, there was nothing. And so they had to do everything for themselves. Once the psychiatric center began to be the main focus of the town eventually took on the name.
The impetus to building mental hospitals were horrific stories in communities of people with mental illness who'd be locked in shacks for years on end, or locked in a bedroom with no exercise, kept away from the world, shunned in a sense. Big improvement over sticking people in poor houses or the basement of 18th century hospitals, chaining people.
It was thought that when industrialization came in and induced this rapid change, that somehow this rapid change was associated with mental illness, that the people who were, we would consider them, I guess, to use a general word, high-strung, had internalized the external chaos, this newly developing external chaos in the outside world. The solution to this by some 19th century social reformers was to try to recreate the stable relationships of agricultural society, to send them out into the country. And if you look actually at the schedules of the early mental institutions, you'll see that there's a real attempt to recreate the old stable agricultural order. The schedules are very, very precise about what you're going to be doing at what time. The buildings are symmetrical. Everything is done in a way that's designed to try to calm people down by making it feel this is going to be an oasis of sanity where none exists.
The Kings Park Psychiatric Center was formed about 1885 from the Kings County Asylum in Brooklyn. They were looking to come to another area where there's more of a park-like setting. They didn't have a lot of the medicines that we have today.
In 1885, when the state hospital was built, there were hundreds and hundreds of jobs, more jobs than there were people in the community at that time. So families would practically get off the boat, so to speak, and move to Kings Park.
As long as you're willing to live out in the middle of nowhere, you can have a job. And that was the attraction to many of the immigrants. And that's how the town grew up around the hospital. A large part of our identity comes from the psychiatric center.
Whatever the mode of treatment, it's essential that it be supplemented by an atmosphere of security and calm. The effective hospital must always serve as a refuge for its patients, a place where they can live quietly during that period of reorientation in which they learn how to achieve a better adjustment to the world outside.
Occupational therapy was a key to the patient's mental health. All of the patients worked on this communal living to plant the vegetables, to weed the gardens, mowing the lawns, working in the slaughterhouse, preparing the food. They made their own electricity. They had their own sewage facilities. They made their own cheese. They even the manure from the farms that was used in the vegetable gardens.
I'd say 90% of the labor was patients. You know, the patients ran the powerhouse. They worked in the coal squad, shoveling coal. They worked in the laundry. You know, I'd say 90% of the bulk of the help in that big, massive laundry were patients. And most of the patients worked in the kitchens and dining rooms. And they do the worst of the work, you know, like unpacking sheets that were soiled and full of urine and all that. And they got, all these patients, they only got, not cash, but they got a $15 club store card where they could take that card and take it to the community store and spend it.